I hope that you came ready this morning because God's got a plan, and we're excited for what he's going to do. So as we've been covering in the series of Daniel, this is our last week of the series of Daniel. And in Daniel, we've been talking about a few things that I'm going to share with you guys very quickly. And the first one is that would your convictions get you convicted of following Christ in a compromising culture? We've been discussing that through this series. Would your convictions get you convicted of following Christ in a compromising culture? And then the other thing that we've been covering is when culture challenges me to compromise, do I conform like a chameleon? Do I contend like a complainer? Or do I conduct myself with conviction? And as we've been looking at the life of Daniel, we've seen that the way that he lived his life, he was a man that conducted himself with conviction. And so we're going to dig in this morning to Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to cover Daniel in the lion's den. But if you have not received a bulletin yet this morning, there are some ushers in the back, and if you have not received one, you can just slip up your hand, and they will bring you one at this time. So as we dig into Daniel chapter 6, Daniel at this point in his life is 82 years old. He's an 82-year-old man, so he's not on the beginning stages of life. As we've covered the other situations in his life, he was much younger in those times. We went through his teenage years and as he grew up, but now he's 82. But I want to stop on 82 years old because whatever your age is in this room, whether you're a sixth grader or possibly younger, or you could find yourself being about 82 years old, maybe you're about there, God can still use you. Whatever age you are, doesn't matter what your status is or how wise you think you are, God can use you. All right? I want that to be something that you guys keep in mind this morning as we go through this passage. And we're talking about Daniel in the lion's den. All right? Many of you know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, but just to let you guys know who have not heard this story before, what happens in this story is that Daniel at this time is a high administrator in the kingdom of King Darius. And he's been being promoted. He's been doing very well. And the other guys and other officials in there are upset at him, don't like him, but they can't find anything wrong with him. And so they're beginning to attack him and try to find out a plan to where they can mess up Daniel's life because they don't like him very much. So then there's a law that's created, and within that law, the lion's den comes into effect. So I'm not going to play spoilers with anything, where I'm going to let you guys figure out the rest of that story as we go through it. But if you can turn with me to Daniel chapter 6, we're going to start at the very beginning of Daniel chapter 6 in verse 1. And we will be talking about standing strong publicly for God. Okay, standing strong publicly. So we're looking at Daniel's life to see how he stood strong publicly in the face of everyone else. So starting in verse 1, it says, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. How many of you would be able to say that if I was to ask someone that you work with or someone in your family, those like, hey, tell me about so-and-so, would they be able to say those 3 qualities? If someone was to go up to Pastor Mark and ask Pastor Mark, hey, does Pastor Eli, tell me about Pastor Eli, would he give me these 3 qualities? These 3 qualities show exactly the character of who Daniel was and the man that we're looking at this morning. But it showed us more of that. As we look at the life of Daniel, we see that Daniel wasn't just a man that was good at his job. Okay, Daniel's a legit man. He's high up in this kingdom. He's done some good things. But what's different about Daniel is what he stands upon. We know that he stands upon God, and that's the difference between him just being someone that's high up in an organization and being someone that people notice as being different. And so this morning I ask you, what is your foundation? What are you standing on this morning? Because many of us stand on a ton of different things other than Jesus. We stand upon careers. We stand upon finances. We stand upon relationships. We stand upon marriages. We stand upon an ability to do something, a skill that we have, something that we enjoy, rather than Jesus. And for me personally, when I was growing up, my students will know that I talk about this pretty often, but I loved the game of baseball. Baseball was my go-to sport. It was a thing that I enjoyed more than anything, and I was good at the game. And so I loved when I was playing. When I was pitching, I felt alive. I felt like nobody could touch me. I felt invincible. And so I loved when people would talk to me about the game of baseball and, pat me on the back and say, "Oh, dude, you're so good," or I loved that kind of stuff. But the problem with all of that is I was standing upon baseball and wasn't standing upon God. God was something that I didn't focus on at all because it was really unimportant to me. Because baseball, I felt, was what I needed. But the problem with baseball is when I got to the situations to when I was alone, to when I wasn't playing the game, and to when somebody wasn't patting me on the back for how good I was doing, the game of baseball failed me. It was pointless because in the moments that I needed it most, it wasn't there. See, the game of baseball, I wanted to play professional baseball. But everybody knows that you get old, right? You age, and then eventually you can't play the game of baseball anymore. I think the oldest guy right now is like 45 years old, and that's like insane that he's still playing a game of baseball. So eventually, no knock on 45-year-olds if you're 45. It's okay. But eventually the game of baseball would have walked out of my life anyhow. And sometimes if you're standing upon a career, you might lose that job. Something in that relationship might happen and you might lose that relationship. If you're standing on those things rather than Jesus, you might be in a situation this morning where you need to evaluate where you stand. Because too many of us stand upon things rather than Jesus Christ. Things. We stand on things that don't matter, things that will wash away eventually, rather than Jesus. And I did that for way too long of my life because as my competence increased, as I got better at the game of baseball, as my competence increased, my dependence on God decreased. So whenever something is going good in your life, it's very easy to stand upon something, but it's so easy to stand on something that is going good that when it is going so good, you get hot and you think you're, big stuff, and all of a sudden it crashes down. And you're left with nothing. Because we're not focusing on Jesus, but we're focusing on ourselves. And so as I was going through my life, I had to realize that I had to say no to something else to be able to say yes to God. Because the game of baseball was so important to me that it took away my ability to love Jesus. And so I had to say no to the game of baseball. I gave baseball up. Hated to do that, but I gave it up. But if something is good in your life, if something is going well, you don't need to give it up. When I say that you have to say no, it doesn't mean that you just completely give it up and walk away from it. It doesn't mean that you need to quit your job or anything like that. What it is a matter of priorities. It's a matter of where your priorities land. The game of baseball was something that I could have continued to do, but I knew for myself I wasn't able to do that. But for your career and the other things that you enjoy, your marriage, a healthy marriage is important, and it's awesome. And I'm thankful for healthy marriages. But if that person becomes above God, then you need to evaluate what you're standing on. In Daniel, this morning, as I said, the first fill in the blank is stand on. Because in the life of Daniel, we see that he stood on Christ. He was the man that he was because he stood on Christ. And so as these men in his life that are around him and working with him are trying to seek out a way to mess up his life because, he's doing things very, very well, these guys realize that there's nothing that they can do in the way that he just lives his life because he's a stand-up guy. And so in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, we see that it says here, so they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. Because they knew that he stood upon God more than he did his position in the kingdom. And so they knew that they couldn't mess him up in the way that he carried himself in the kingdom because he was legit. But they knew if there was one thing that Daniel wouldn't compromise on and that they could get him to mess up in, it would be his relationship with Jesus. They knew that they could find a hole when it came to God in his life. And so Daniel had to make a stand. Daniel had to know what he was standing upon. But you see, Daniel wasn't an overnight success. How many of you guys feel like you were the most amazing Christian in the world? Okay, so you weren't an overnight success, right? You didn't get there right away, neither did Daniel. All right, Daniel's 82 years old now. He went through a lot. He did a lot. He grew. But the only reason that he grew is that he was consistent in one thing. He was able to stand tall because he had faithfully knelt before the one true king. He spent multiple times a day in prayer with Jesus. That's why he was able to stand how he was, because he humbled himself and never let himself get above Jesus. Never let himself get above God. It wasn't going to happen for him. And that's the man that we're looking at this morning. He was a man of super high character. A man that wouldn't take anything from no one because he knew what he stood upon. And you know what? I know there might be some people in this room this morning that you don't have a relationship with Jesus. You're really unsure about it. You're not sure if that's the thing that you want to do. I mean, I was that way for so long. But eventually, you get to a spot where you've got nowhere else to turn. And I guarantee you that Jesus is there for you this morning. He's there for you this morning. And so we see as the story continues, Daniel, in Daniel chapter 6, verse 6 through 9, we see here that it says, "So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, 'Long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone divine or human except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked.' So King Darius signed the law." So at this point, Daniel is facing a situation to where he can be thrown into the lion's den. Based on what he does at this point, all hinges basically on his life, right? Anybody a fan of lions? I mean, God created them. It's okay if you like them. But if you ever gone to the zoo and you're standing in front of the lion exhibit, and whether it's glass or there's a fence or something like that, there's only like this much space between you and the lions. And if that glass broke or if that fence didn't work, you'd be dead meat, right? Literally dead meat. And so these things are no joke. So Daniel in this situation is like, dude, if I don't follow this law, I'm going to end up this lion's dinner. So in that situation, Daniel has to make a decision. What do I really want to do? What do I really stand upon? Do I really care this much about my life to not do what I know I should do? He's in this spot. When faced with a situation that tests his character, what is he going to decide to do? So in your life, when you're faced with a situation that attacks your character, what are you going to do? When you're faced with a situation, it could be big, it could be small, it could be in work, that they want you to do something else, and you know that you shouldn't do it. But if you don't do it, it's possible that you could lose your job, and you don't want to lose your job because you've got to provide for your family. Or if you don't do this, your friend group that you have will disown you, make fun of you, reject you. You know, it could be as simple as, me being a 23-year-old, I'm college age, but I'm not a college student. But I relate to many of the guys here to where a lot of the conversations that happens within men is inappropriate and not good. And so if I'm in a group of people and somebody says something, I have an opportunity to either stand there and join in or to do something different. But I face a situation where I have to decide who I want to be and what I want to do. Daniel was somebody that stood out. We want to be people that stand out. It could be as simple for high school students, middle school students, that when a test is happening, you're not the person that cheats on a test. It's small things like that. Because like I said, we're not looking at Daniel this morning because of how good of a preacher he was and how many people he was saving for the gospel. Right here in this section of Scripture, we're just looking at how much of a stand-up guy he was, how much character was important to him, how he lived out a relationship with Jesus. Too often we make it too big of a deal. We think of the biggest possible reasons, but we forget about all the small things that really affect us more. Because how am I supposed to get up here and preach if the people that I'm around hear me making inappropriate jokes or laughing at something? That affects my character. So the small things you do taints your character. The way that you carry yourself in the workplace, in your friends group, and in your family really shows who Jesus is in your life. And so what could Daniel do in this situation? He could stop praying to God, right? Like I said, he's about to be dinner for lions. Does anybody else want to just stop praying to God right now? If that's you and you're about to face that, are you going to stop praying to God? You're at least going to think about it. I'm going to think about it. Let's be real. You're not like 100% like the most perfect Christian. You're going to think about something here. So Daniel's evaluating these things. What can he do? He could stop praying to God. Or he could accept the law and he could fake pray for 30 days to the king. Right? We've all fake prayed before. You know, when it's time for grandpa and grandma to pray for the food. And so everybody bows their head and closes their eyes and they start praying. And you're actually praying for the food at first, but then all of a sudden they pray way too long and you're like, oh my gosh, I just want to eat. That's all you're thinking about right now. But your eyes are still closed and your head is still bowed, so you're still praying, right? Grandpa and grandma would never know. So you're good. He could do that. He's not actually praying to the king. Like, what's the big deal? He's facing lions, of course. Or, I guess he could keep praying, but he could do it in secret, right? Would any of us judge Daniel if he did that? Prayed in secret? No, of course not. Because that's what we basically all do. When you have your time with the Lord, you're praying in secret. Typically, you're always praying in secret. Sometimes we're afraid to pray publicly, like whether it's at the lunch table at school. I remember there would be moments where sometimes I would actually be like doing really well with Jesus, and so I would close my eyes and I would bow my head and I would pray for my lunch at school. And there would be other times where I'd be like, I can't do that, so I would be, eyes wide open. I'd be praying in my head. I was still praying. I was just praying in secret, right? There are situations that happen like that. Or at the restaurant, when you decide to pray or don't pray, or if it's super quick so that people don't see you. Daniel wasn't afraid of anything like that. He knew that he stood out, and he was happy that he stood out. And so praying in secret would have been fine. He was still praying, but that goes against Daniel's character and who he was as a man, as a Christ follower. That would go against him, even though it wasn't wrong. So Daniel wouldn't have been sinning for doing that. It still was not who he was. And so that's what sometimes in life you need to look at situations and say, you know what? I'm not sinning. This isn't bad that I do this, but am I compromising on my character? Am I compromising on what I believe and who I am? A small thing like that. Daniel said, you know what? That's not me. I'm not going to do it that way. So the final thing that Daniel could do is that he could keep praying publicly as he'd done all his life. And the reason for that is that your character stands out. Your character stands out. And the man that Daniel was said, this is who I am as a person. This is who I am in my relationship with God. And I'm not going to compromise on this. I'm not going to compromise on this thing that I could do to save myself. because that's dishonoring God, because I know who I am. Daniel knew who he stood upon. Do you know who you are? Daniel knew who he was. He knew that he was a child of God. He knew he wasn't an administrator. That wasn't his title. That was his job, but that's not who he was. He was a child of God. Do you know who you are this morning? Do you know who you stand on? Do you have the ability to stand on and stand out? And in verse 10, we see how Daniel responds to this situation. And it says, "But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he has always done, giving thanks to his God." Because Daniel was not going to compromise on who he was. Wasn't going to change who he was no matter what faced him. You may be facing a situation this morning that causes you to compromise in some way. That you're looking at, if I don't make this decision, I might lose this, I might lose that, I might lose my job, I might lose these friends. You could be facing something. But if it causes you to compromise on who you are, then don't do it. Because your character makes you stand out. When you make one small decision, it affects your complete reputation and character of the way that you live. Because then when you make one decision, even if you've completely cleaned up your life and you don't do that stuff anymore, guess what? People still remember that one time you did this. Sometimes that's not fair, right? That people still look at our past, but it shows how important it is the way that we live our life, how important character matters. If your character matches up and lines up with God and His Word, people are going to be more likely to accept you, respond to you, follow you, and pay attention to you. If you're just like everybody else and your character is just like everybody else's, why would anybody pay attention to you? You're not special. We're all special, right? But we're not better than anybody else, so why is somebody going to pay attention to me if there's someone else over here that is living their life that, shoot, I want to be like them? That's how it was with Daniel. People noticed who he was, and they took record of that. And he influenced more people than what he realized he was doing. So in verse 11 through 13, these guys that have been trying to capture or trick Daniel into doing this, trying to catch him, they finally do. They go to his house, they catch him because Daniel wasn't going to compromise, so he's praying as he always did, and they catch him. So then they run to King Darius and they say, "King Darius, you know that law that you made to where nobody can pray to you except for 30 days? Yes, of course I remember that law. Like, I made it, like people are praying to me. I'm high and mighty." He's not going to forget that. So he's like, "Yes." Well, they're like, "Well, Daniel, he's praying to his God and not to you. He's disobeying the law." And the king in this situation, it says that he's troubled because he actually cares about Daniel. He likes Daniel. He doesn't want this to happen because he can trust him. So the man that made the law, the man that was being prayed to, still cared about this guy who was going against his law because of who he was. So that shows in the face of a situation, when you carry yourself in a way that is different than what everybody else does, it makes an impact. You may still find yourself in the lion's den, but you made an impact. In verses 16 through 20, we see what happens here. And in verse 16 it says, "So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, 'May your God whom you serve so faithfully rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God whom you serve so faithfully able to rescue you from the lions?' Daniel answered, 'Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight. and I have not wronged you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had then them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Guys, you know that's very significant, right? Why is that significant? Because the lions that Daniel was just chilling with tore apart these other people. There were still the same lions that were in there already killing everybody else. But for whatever reason, they became like dogs. All right? I remember thinking about this. They become like dogs. Like Daniel's like their house pets. You know, and Daniel's petting the lions. Why on earth did Daniel make it out of the lion's den without a scratch on him? Because it says right here, not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. So you may be facing a situation to where you find yourself in a lion's den this morning. Or you may be facing a situation to where you could possibly find yourself in a lion's den. Well, guess what? When you have faith and trust in God, nothing can overcome you. Nothing can defeat you because God is with you. When you have faith and trust in Him, nothing can overtake you. You may find yourself in a situation that stinks because guess what? Life stinks. Life isn't fair. You might find yourself in a situation. You may do everything right and still find yourself in a situation that stinks. But if God is with you, then nothing can overtake you. Nothing can defeat you. So whatever you're facing, have faith and trust in God. Because standing for God is a victory over fear. All right, the next thing that we see that Daniel did was that he stands for God. He had to make that decision to stand for God. He knew he was standing on. He knew that he was standing out. But you can stand on God and stand out and still not stand for Him. Okay? Standing on and standing out is still a good thing. But you're missing the final key. When you stand on and you stand out, you're going to be presented with opportunities to stand for. And when you stand for is whether or not you're actually committed to Jesus. That shows the final commitment. Because guess what? In our culture, the culture that I live in with you guys, we are controlled by fear, right? We are so controlled by what everybody else thinks. So controlled by the fact that we might not have enough money, that we might be single, that this thing might happen to us and this thing might happen to us. We think of everything that is negative. We're controlled by fear. Rather than resting in the peace that God brings for us, we sit in fear. Because we often fear culture more than we do God. So ask yourself this morning, do I fear God more than I fear culture? Do I fear God more than I do losing my job? Of losing that relationship, losing that friendship? Do I fear God more than the possible rejection that I can face from people by just living my life for Him? We would rather honor ourselves but dishonor God in many situations. Because we want to make sure that we're taken care of and we want to make sure that we're good. And so as long as we're good, it doesn't really matter what else happens. If we dishonor God, it happens, right? As long as we're good, it's okay. But you see, to stand for God, sometimes you've got to be willing to take the rejection. Sometimes you've got to be willing to lay yourself down and not honor yourself, but honor the King. But it's up to you. It's a decision that you make. God doesn't force anything upon you. Daniel, imagine a life where we read this story and Daniel doesn't have faith in God, where he doesn't trust in God. What would this story be? Who would Daniel be? We probably would be preaching on Daniel this morning. So imagine a life where you did things differently. Imagine a life where you stood out. Imagine a life where we all stand out, where I stand out. And I live for God. What would that look like? Who would I impact? Whose life would be forever changed by the way that I just live my life? And in Daniel chapter 6, verses 25 through 28, we see what happens in a situation like this. And do not miss this. Do not miss this, because this is a powerful, powerful passage. And it says, Then King Darius sent his message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, and he has restored Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So he is the living God. He is alive. He is alive within you. When you stand upon him, nothing can defeat you, nothing can destroy you, because you are with God. You may be facing a situation, but Jesus is with you. You're not facing it alone. You say, you know what, I'm going to stand for God. I'm going to cross that line, and I'm going to stand for God. You're not alone. You've got power behind you. You've got authority behind you, because he is living and he is with you. And there is power with him. And what happens, what we see here, is that standing for God encourages and influences other people. But it doesn't just influence and encourage believers. It encourages the people that do not believe. It encourages the people that are above you and the people that are below you. Do you think that Daniel thought in this situation, when he was having to stand for God, when he would be thrown into the lion's den, do you think he would understand that King Darius after that would make a declaration to say everybody serves Daniel's God because he is the living God? Do you think Daniel was thinking about that? Probably not. He was probably thinking about how he's going to die or not. But when you make a stand for God, it influences people. And your influence matters, because when you stand for God, great things happen. People's lives will be forever changed when you decide to stand for Jesus.